Nobody in the room noticed her walk in. That was fine. Simone Adeyemi had spent the better part of her professional life being the person nobody noticed until she opened her mouth. She was used to it. She had learned, sometime around her second year as a systems analyst at Meridian Consulting, that invisibility was a tool if you knew how to use it. You could learn a room before it learned you. You could watch the architecture of power before anyone decided to perform for you. You could be standing in the middle of a crisis and understand it completely before anyone remembered to ask. She walked into the 43rd floor conference room of the Kang Group building at 7:42 in the morning, 12 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, and she stood near the window for a moment and looked at what she had walked into. It was bad. She could tell from the energy before a single word was spoken. There was a specific quality to a room full of intelligent people who had been awake for 36 hours trying to solve something they couldn't solve. A particular texture of desperation wearing a professional mask. She had seen it before. She knew what it smelled like. The conference table seated 20. 14 of them were filled. She recognized 3 people. Paul Shin, Meridian's account director, who had called her at 5:30 that morning, in a voice she had never heard from him before, thin and controlled in the way of someone managing genuine fear. Beside him, a woman she knew from a financial systems conference 2 years ago, whose name she was pulling up. Yoon Ji-ah, Kang Group's chief operating officer. And at the head of the table, a Korean man in his mid-40s with a face that suggested he had been built by someone who believed that softness was a resource better spent elsewhere. She did not know who he was yet. She set her bag down at the one remaining seat near the end of the table. Paul looked up and the relief on his face was briefly and involuntarily visible before he managed it back into professionalism. "Simone," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming." She nodded once. "Tell me what we're dealing with," he told her. It took 9 minutes. While he talked, she opened her laptop, pulled up the access credentials they had sent her at 6 a.m., and started looking at the system architecture documents they had shared. While she was looking, 3 other people at the table gave her sideways glances of the particular variety she also recognized. The slight narrowing of the eyes that said, "Who is this? And why is she here? And is this really the best we could do?" She kept reading. At 7:58, the man at the head of the table looked at his phone, set it face down, and said, without preamble, in English that carried a slight Seoul accent smoothed by years in international business, "We have until 9 o'clock this morning. After that, the window closes, and the damage becomes irreversible. I want solutions, not analysis of why we don't have solutions." He looked around the table. "If you have something, say it. If you don't, figure out why." He did not look at Simone. She was at the far end of the table and she had arrived 12 minutes ago, and he had 14 other people to look at who had presumably been working on this for 36 hours. She understood the logic. She didn't take it personally. She kept reading. "If this is your first time here, drop your city in the comments below right now. I want to see where this story finds you. Hit that like button and stay with me, because this woman is about to do something in that room that nobody is going to forget. And it starts in the next 2 minutes. Her name was Simone Adeyemi. She was 31 years old, originally from Atlanta by way of Lagos, by way of a childhood that had involved 2 continents, 3 languages, and a mother who had been an electrical engineer, and a father who had been a literature professor, and who between them had produced a daughter who approached every problem as if it were simultaneously a circuit to be traced and a story to be understood. She had a master's degree in information systems from Georgia Tech and a second one in financial mathematics from Columbia, that she had finished in 14 months because the program was theoretically 18, and she had found the pace unsatisfying. She had worked at Meridian for 4 years and had a reputation among the people who paid attention to such things as someone you called when the problem was the kind that didn't have a clean category. She was also, on this particular morning, running on 4 hours of sleep, a gas station coffee she had bought on the way to the Kang Group building that she had already finished, and the specific focused energy that arrived in her when a problem was genuinely interesting. This problem was genuinely interesting. What had happened, as best she could reconstruct from the documents flooding her screen, was the following. The Kang Group's primary transaction processing platform, The system that handled the clearing and settlement of approximately $400 million in daily transaction volume across 6 integrated business units had experienced what the technical team was calling an anomalous cascade event at 3:17 the previous morning. The system had not crashed. That would have been simpler. The system was running. It was processing. It was generating outputs. But something in the logic layer, specifically in the reconciliation protocol that ensured the integrity of cross-unit transfers, had shifted. The outputs looked correct. On the surface, running standard validation checks, they cleared. But Paul had told her, and she was now confirming with her own eyes in the architecture documentation, that the anomaly was in the hash verification layer, 3 levels below where the standard checks ran. The system was producing results that appeared correct and were not. In practice, this meant that for the past 33 hours, an unknown quantity of transactions had been processed and recorded with errors that the system itself did not flag, that the standard audit protocols did not catch, and that would not become visible in the reconciliation reports until the daily settlement window closed at 9 a.m. At that point, every discrepancy would surface simultaneously across all 6 business units, and the cascade effect of that surfacing on Kang Group's positions, its counterparty relationships, and its regulatory standing would be, as Paul had put it at 5:30 this morning in that thin, careful voice, significant. What they needed was a way to identify and isolate every affected transaction in the system before 9 a.m., and either correct or quarantine them before settlement closed. They had been trying to build that isolation protocol for 36 hours. They hadn't managed it. Simone read for 6 more minutes while the room talked around her. She listened to 3 proposed solutions, tracked the logic of each, identified where each one broke down. The first would work in a system with static inputs. This system didn't have static inputs. The second correctly identified the hash layer as the problem, but proposed a patch that would require taking the system offline for 4 hours minimum, which was 4 hours they didn't have. The third was technically elegant and practically wrong, because the person proposing it hadn't accounted for the asynchronous processing queue, which was currently holding 2 days of overflow, and would reintroduce the error the moment the patch was applied. She kept reading. At 8:11, the man at the head of the table said, in a voice that had not changed in temperature or pace, but that carried something new in it, something that suggested the controlled management of very serious pressure. I want the offline option back on the table. Walk me through the minimum downtime scenario again. The technical lead, a man in his 30s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been staring at the same problem for a day and a half, started talking. He was 3 sentences in when Simone said, without raising her voice, without looking up from her screen, "That won't work either. The asynchronous queue will reintroduce the error on restart. You'll have a clean system for approximately 4 minutes before the overflow processes, and you're back to the same problem with less time to address it." The room went quiet. She looked up for the first time since she had sat down. 14 faces looking at her. Paul with an expression of careful hope, Yoon Jia with quick professional reassessment, the technical lead with something between offense and consideration, and the man at the head of the table, who was looking at her now for what she was fairly certain was the first time, with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not the assessment she had seen from the others. Something more complete than that. Like he wasn't just looking at her, but looking at everything she had said and the 17 things she hadn't said yet, and making rapid calculations about all of it. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked back at her screen. "So what's your solution?" he said. His voice was the same temperature. Conversational, precise, the kind of tone that didn't fluctuate because fluctuation was information, and he was careful with information. "I don't have one yet," she said. "I've been in the room for 29 minutes and I've been reading your architecture documentation for 20 of those. Give me until 8:30. Another silence. Shorter. 8:30, he said, like he was noting it in a calendar. She went back to her screen. The next 18 minutes were the kind of work she was built for. Not the performance of work, not the narration of progress, just the actual movement through a complex system looking for the thing that was true and the thing that could be done about it. She ignored the room. She ignored the 2 additional solution proposals that came up and were dismissed. She ignored the sound of someone's phone buzzing repeatedly and the low, urgent conversation that followed. She followed the architecture documents down through the layers to the place where the problem actually lived, and she sat in it and turned it around and looked at it from angles that the people who had built the system couldn't look at because they were too close to it and had stopped being able to see it clearly. The problem was in the validation sequence, specifically in the assumption the validation sequence made about the order in which inputs would arrive. The original design assumed a synchronized input stream. Somewhere in the system's operational history, a load balancing update had introduced micro delays in one of the input channels that were small enough to be invisible to performance monitoring, but large enough to occasionally push inputs out of sequence. When that happened, the hash verification passed because it was checking inputs against the wrong reference state. The system believed it was correct. It was not. The solution, she saw at 827, was not to fix the hash layer. It was to insert a sequencing checkpoint 3 steps upstream of the hash verification, one that would catch the out-of-order inputs before they reached the validation logic and hold them until the sequence was restored. It wouldn't require taking the system offline. It wouldn't touch the transaction data that had already been processed. It would stop the error from propagating further, and it would create a clean audit trail of everything that had processed through the anomalous window, which the reconciliation team could then address transaction by transaction before settlement closed. It would take approximately 20 minutes to build and deploy if she did it herself, and the system had to remain running the entire time, which meant she would be working on a live production environment with $400 million in daily transaction volume and no safety net. She looked at the time. 8:29. She looked up. The man at the head of the table was watching her. He had been, she thought, for the last several minutes. She said, "I have something. It's a sequencing checkpoint upstream of your hash verification. It doesn't take the system offline, it won't touch existing transaction data, and it will give your reconciliation team a clean audit trail to work from. I need administrator access to the production environment, and I need everyone in this room to stay out of the system for the next 20 minutes. The room was completely still. The man at the head of the table looked at her. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. That was unusual. She was generally good at reading what people were thinking. Full administrator access, he said, on a live production system, with our entire daily transaction volume running. Yes, she said. And if it doesn't work, then you're in the same position you're already in, but with 18 minutes less time. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he said to Yoonjia, without looking away from Simone, "Give her the access." She had the credentials in 40 seconds. She was in the system in under a minute. She did not look up again. What followed was 21 minutes of work that she would later struggle to describe to anyone who hadn't done it. Not because it was impossible to explain, but because the experience of it was primarily internal. The architecture of the problem was clear to her now in the way that a piece of music could be clear once you understood the structure of it, and what she was doing was inserting a correction into the score without stopping the orchestra. She built the checkpoint in stages, testing each component against a sandboxed version of the system before deploying to production, watching the inputs flow through the new logic and sequence correctly, watching the hash verification receive ordered data and pass it cleanly. At 8:49, she deployed the final component. She watched the system process 312 transactions through the new checkpoint. Every single one cleared correctly. She sat back. She closed her laptop. She looked at the time. 8:51, 9 minutes before settlement closed. She looked up. The technical lead was watching his own screen with an expression that had moved through several stages and arrived at something that looked like reluctant wonder. Yoon-jia was on the phone speaking quietly and quickly. Paul was looking at Simone with the expression of someone who had been genuinely frightened and was beginning to believe the fear was over. The man at the head of the table had not moved. He was looking at Simone. "It's holding," the technical lead said. "Inputs are sequencing correctly. The audit trail is clean." He paused. "It's actually holding." The room changed. Not dramatically, not with celebration. The people in it were professionals, and the crisis had not fully resolved yet, and there was significant reconciliation work still ahead. But the quality of the air shifted. The particular texture of 36 hours of desperate searching gave way to something else, something that had room in it for the first real breath. Simone began packing up her laptop. The man at the head of the table said, still in that same precise voice, still at the same temperature, "What's your name?" She looked at him. "Simone Adeyemi." He considered that. "How long have you been at Meridian?" 4 years. "And before that?" "Columbia. Georgia Tech before that." He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they're not agreeing with something but filing it. He looked at Yoon-jia, who had ended her call. "Make sure she has everything she needs for the reconciliation documentation." He looked back at Simone. "I'd like to speak with you when this is done, if you have time." She had already decided, in the 4 seconds between his first question and this one, that she was going to agree. Not because of the room or the building or the name on the door, because of the quality of attention he had given the problem. Because of the speed with which he had made the decision to give a stranger full access to a live production system running $400 million in daily volume, and the complete absence of second-guessing once he'd made it. That was not a common quality. She had worked with enough people to know how uncommon it was. She had time, she said. His name was Kang Seo-jun. She found that out from Paul during the 20 minutes she spent in a separate room completing the reconciliation documentation that the settlement team needed before the 9 o'clock window. Kang Seo-jun, 42 years old, chairman and primary shareholder of Kang Group International, which operated across financial services, logistics, and private equity, with a combined asset base that Paul cited with the quiet emphasis of someone who found the number impressive and expected her to as well. She filed the number and moved on. Numbers were useful for context. They weren't, in her experience, a reliable indicator of the things that actually mattered about a person. She was back in the main conference room at 9:17, the settlement window cleanly closed, the reconciliation process underway, the crisis officially contained. Most of the room had dispersed. Yoon-jia was still there, on another call. The technical lead was there, working through the audit trail with 2 junior analysts. Paul was there, looking like a man who had been told he could stop holding his breath. And Kang Seo-jun was there, standing at the window with his phone in his hand, looking out at the city. He turned when she came in. He said, "Can I get you something?" "Coffee. Water." She said, "Coffee would be good." He got it himself. That surprised her. She didn't let it show on her face, but she noted it. They sat at one end of the long conference table, the rest of the room doing its quiet work around them, and he set a coffee in front of her and sat across from her and looked at her with that quality of attention she had noticed from across the room. Up close, it was more specific. He was not performing interest. He was simply interested. There was a difference. "You identified a problem in 20 minutes that my technical team hadn't found in 36 hours, he said. He wasn't asking her to explain it. He was stating it because it was true, and he was the kind of person who stated true things plainly. "Your technical team was too close to it," she said. "They built the system. They had assumptions about how it worked that they couldn't see around. I came in without those assumptions." "That's part of it," he said. "The other part is that you understood the architecture faster than anyone in this room who hadn't built it. That's not a common skill." She drank her coffee. It was better coffee than the gas station one. That was a low bar. It was also genuinely good. I've been working with complex systems long enough that the architecture starts to feel like a language. Once you know the language, reading a new document is just comprehension. He looked at her. Most people who say something like that are making a larger claim than the evidence supports. Most people are, she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more like the acknowledgement that a point had been made and he respected the precision of it. "What does Meridian pay you?" he said. She looked at him. "That's a direct question." "Yes," she told him. He absorbed it without expression. "That's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I'd like to offer you a 6-month engagement as a systems consultant directly to Kang Group. Your scope would be a full audit of our transaction processing infrastructure and a risk assessment of our other core systems. You'd have direct access to everything you need and a team of 3 analysts. I'd want a preliminary findings report within 60 days. She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about 3 things simultaneously. The first was the professional merit of the offer, which was substantial. The second was that she had just spent 21 minutes working on a live production system for this man, and he had not introduced himself or explained who he was before asking her to do it, which told her something about how he operated. The third was that Paul had said, in the car on the way over at 6:15 this morning, "Be careful with the Kang Group," and had not elaborated, and she had not asked. And now she was sitting across from Kang Seo-jun with a job offer, and she still hadn't asked. "What does be careful mean, in your experience?" she said. He looked at her. "I don't know what that refers to. Someone told me to be careful with Kang Group this morning, before I came in. I'm asking what they meant." He was quiet. She watched him decide something. It was a specific process. She could see the quality of it, the internal assessment of what was true and how much of it to say. "Kang Group's business interests are diverse," he said. "Some of those interests exist in spaces that are less straightforward than others. I run legitimate operations with precision, and I expect the same from everyone who works within them. The spaces that are less straightforward are managed separately, and by people who understand those spaces. You would not encounter them in this engagement." She absorbed that. The honesty of it, carefully bounded, was more informative than a clean denial would have been. "And if I encounter something I'm not comfortable with," she said, "you tell me directly and we address it. Or you walk. Your choice. No consequences in either direction." She looked at him. She was deciding something too. She could feel the shape of it. She said, "I'd want the scope in writing before I agree to anything." "Of course," he said, "and I want to talk to your technical lead about the system history before I start. I need to understand what other updates have been applied in the last 18 months. The problem today was a load balancing update that introduced the micro delay. I want to know what else might be sitting in the system waiting to create a similar issue." He nodded once. "That's a reasonable starting point. And," she said, "I work alone until I've seen enough of the system to know what I need the 3 analysts for. I don't want people in my process before I've established my own understanding." He looked at her. "That's an unusual request." "I know how I work," she said. The corner of his mouth moved again. "Fair," he said. She drank the last of her coffee. She set the mug down. She looked at him across the corner of the conference table. This man she had not known existed 4 hours ago. In this room she had walked into while nobody noticed her. With this problem she had solved in 21 minutes that 36 hours of effort hadn't cracked. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and how much space lived between them. She thought about Paul's voice at 5:30 in the morning. She thought about the architecture of systems, how every complex structure had assumptions buried inside it that the people who built them couldn't always see, and how the only way to find those assumptions was to walk in from the outside with clear eyes. She thought about the fact that he had gotten the coffee himself. "Send me the scope document," she said. "I'll review it tonight." He nodded. "I'll have it to you by 6. She packed up her bag. She stood. He stood. She was 5'8", and he had a few inches on her. She noticed the tattoos at his neck, dark geometric lines that began below his jaw and disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. She had noticed them earlier in the meeting and set the observation aside, because the meeting had been more important than observation. She noted them now and noted what they meant in the context of everything else she had learned that morning, and filed it in the same place she filed everything that wasn't immediately useful, but might become so. She held out her hand. He shook it. Firm, brief, no performance in it. "Simone Adeyemi," he said, like he was recording the name somewhere that didn't delete. She said, "I'll look for the document at 6. She walked out of the conference room. She walked down the 43rd floor corridor to the elevator. She pressed the button and waited, and thought about nothing in particular, and also about everything at once, which was her usual mode of processing. Paul caught up with her at the elevator. His relief had settled into something more complicated. "That went well," he said carefully. "The problem is solved," she said. "Whether the rest of it went well, I'll know more about in 60 days. He looked at her. "The scope document." "Yes. Be careful," he said again. The same words, the same careful voice. She looked at him. "Paul, what specifically are you telling me to be careful of?" He was quiet for a moment. He was a good account director. He understood risk, and he managed it carefully. He was also, she had known for 4 years, fundamentally a decent person. "He's not dangerous to the people he works with," Paul said finally. "In my experience, he is dangerous to the people who come at him sideways or try to use something he cares about to get to him. The people who work inside his circle are protected." She absorbed that. "And the people outside his circle?" Paul looked at the elevator doors. "A different calculation," he said. The elevator arrived. She got in. She pressed lobby. She looked at the closing doors and thought about circles and the edges of them, and the specific architecture of a world built in layers, 2 floors showing, everything else below the waterline. She thought about 21 minutes of work on a live production system. About a man who had decided in 3 seconds to trust her with something that his own people had been trying to solve for a day and a half. She thought about the quality of his attention. How he had given the problem the same regard he had given her. Complete, unhurried, unperformative. She thought about the scope document arriving at 6 p.m. She was going to read it very carefully. She was going to ask the right questions. She was going to walk into this thing. If she walked into it, with her eyes open and her assumptions clearly labeled and her understanding of the architecture honest. That was how you worked on a system you didn't build. You didn't pretend you understood it before you did. You started from what was actually true, and you followed the logic forward from there. The lobby doors opened. She walked out into the morning. The city was fully awake now, bright and loud and moving with the specific momentum of 9:45 on a Tuesday in Lower Manhattan. She walked through it and thought about systems and assumptions and the things that looked correct but weren't, and the things that looked complicated but had a solution if you were willing to follow the logic all the way down to where it actually lived. The scope document arrived at 5:58. She was at her drafting table in her Crown Heights apartment, working on a separate project for a different client, when her phone buzzed. She set down her work and opened the document. It was detailed. More detailed than she had expected. The scope was technically precise, the terms were clear, and at the bottom, added in what was clearly a late addition to the document, was a note in plain text that said, "The load balancing update was applied in March of last year by a contractor who is no longer with the company. I would have wanted to know about the risk it introduced before today. That is one of the things I am hoping you will tell me about the rest of the system." She read the note twice. She set down her phone. She thought about a man who could have made the note sound like a business requirement, and instead made it sound like the truth. She picked up her phone. She sent a message to the number the document had come from. 4 words. "I'll sign it tomorrow." She set the phone down. She looked at the Ando print on her wall, the one she had bought at a flea market in her first year in New York as a promise to herself about the kind of work she intended to do. Clean structures, honest systems, things built to last because they had been built with integrity in the foundation and not just in the surfaces. Her phone buzzed once. She looked at it. "Good," he had written. "See you Monday." She set it down. She went back to her work. Outside her window, Crown Heights was doing its early evening thing, the specific sound of a neighborhood that knew what it was and didn't require anyone's approval for it. She thought about systems and what they revealed about the people who built them. She thought about Monday. She thought about walking into a room full of layers and beginning, as she always did, at the only place that made sense to begin, at the truth of how the thing actually worked. She finished her project. She made dinner. She sat on her couch and read for an hour. She did not think about Kang Seo-jun for the rest of the evening, which was either successful management of her own attention or a very good performance of it. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she wasn't entirely sure which one. But when she fell asleep that night, She was thinking about architecture, about the patience required to understand a system you hadn't built, about the particular kind of trust involved in handing someone full access to something you couldn't afford to lose, and then staying out of their way. About the things that looked complicated from the outside and turned out, when you followed the logic all the way down, to have a solution. About the fact that finding the solution was only ever the beginning. She was already thinking about Monday.